So, welcome back, parents. Today, we're going to talk about judgments. One of the many ways, and there are many ways, we unconsciously project our stuff, our baggage onto our children is by judging them. We constantly judge our children. We're always labeling them, their actions as good or bad or positive or negative, as if someone has appointed us the judge and the jury, the wardens, the prisoners, and the persecutors. When I first became conscious of myself around my child, I was literally shocked at how full of judgment I was. It was as if I had self-appointed myself to be her eternal adjudicator, constantly endorsing or critiquing her, as if she had solicited my opinion 24/7. Even if I was praising her, trust me, I was subconsciously judging her. I was letting her know that this behavior I approved of. So she should continue this behavior. And that behavior, not so much. So don't continue it. It was as if I was piecemealing her every moment and movement in time and putting it into categories of good and bad, constantly critiquing her. And the more I became aware of myself, the more I saw that almost everything out of my mouth was either a veiled praise or an utter, deliberate condemnation. And when I saw this judgment monster, so to speak, within me, this led to my awareness of my own inner critic, my own inner tribunal of critics and judges. In fact, every judgment I had toward my daughter, I began to see, came from my own inner slew of critics within. I was plagued by inner judgment, and that's why it kept spewing out toward my daughter. And maybe on this quest today, you can begin being aware of perhaps your inner tribunal of judges. It was only when I began to dig really deep into the nature of judgment that I was able to create an antidote for myself, find a salve, a balm to counteract the often poisonous effects of judgment. We judge ourselves ultimately because all of us really were raised on this, as I've said, this diet of unworthiness. We feel this constant need to compare and contrast ourselves with others, and this is so unreasonable. In wisdom, there is no comparison. How can we compare ourselves with others? Yet, all of us plague ourselves and our children under a constant deluge of judgment. So the antidote to judgment that I discovered for myself and began cultivating is the antidote of humility and compassion. So let's break this down. Even though it's beyond our conscious awareness on a moment-by-moment awareness, it is really essential for us to recognize that when we judge others, either positively or negatively, we're actually doing so out of this false and deluded sense of superiority. After all, think about it. Who are we to judge anyone? Who are we to know what's ultimately good or bad? Who made us the rulers of others to think that we can dictate them into how to be? Who made us psychics to know that what we are observing or judging or labeling as good is really good in the future? After all, what we think is good in the moment could turn out to be really bad in the very next moment. So by judging events or actions or ways of being in these strict dualities of good or bad, really in essence allows us to place ourselves on this deluded false pedestal of knowing. And let me tell you, there is a misplaced sense of superiority and authority that we have narcissistically handed to ourselves. And this is part of living in unconsciousness. This is part of being asleep. A large portion of the earth dimension currently believes it is righteously correct. It is righteously better than another group of people or another race. It's an indication of being asleep. And we do this to our children all the time. We're constantly judging them, and we don't even realize that we are putting this onto them. So really, in order to step down from this misplaced pedestal of false superiority, we need to enter a state of bravery. We need to be brave enough to be humble, because humility is a courageous act. And we need to realize that we have no right to cast judgment, either through praise or aspersions, especially onto our children, because they are evolving beings. They are not static identities. They are ever growing into who they need to be. So when we judge them, we're almost saying that they are who we're judging them as, but they are actually about to evolve, about to change. They're constantly fluid. So we must enter a state of deeper compassion, not only for our children, but for ourselves and all sentient beings. So what is compassion in essence? It isn't just an idea or a thought. It's an embodied way of being. It is a way out of the mind and into the heart. It is the understanding that being human is hard for everyone. And we are all fragile. And when we're fragile, we're going to act out. Our insecurities are going to show up everywhere, spilling like blood all over. We all spill our insecurities and vulnerabilities. We all have defense systems to cope. We all have anger, we all have fear. So when we begin to see our shared humanity, we begin to understand that all of us are craving for worth, for validation, for safety. All of us live with this fear. So why can't we understand this about our children? Why can't we have greater compassion where we accept them for all of who they are without placing these very strict compartmentalized judgments on them? When we enter a state of compassion, we immediately enter an expansion from within, where we have a greater tolerance for all expressions of self. Because we understand our own self, because we've been brave enough to see our own envy, our own jealousy, our own comparisons, our own pettiness, it is through self-understanding that what this quest is all about, that we begin to understand all expressions of our children. So our tolerance for ourselves ultimately leads to a tolerance of diversity through all humankind. So just imagine if you were to understand that you are not a superior being here as the adjudicator of your child's being. Imagine if you released the duty and obligation to judge your children. Now imagine what that would be replaced by. It would be replaced by this resplendent radiance, with this sense of celebration of your children's ways of being. You would be bathed in this sense of appreciation, of acceptance, and mostly this trust that your children are powerful enough to unfold into who they're meant to be without your interjection and labeling. This understanding that we are no greater than anyone, nor are we lesser than anyone. It allows us to begin accepting our own spiritual path as unique, as separate, as distinct. And as we accept our own path, we begin to understand that each human being here, especially and including our children, is here on their own quest, their own discovery of wholeness, on their own timeline. Just because we may accelerate ourselves into a different state of consciousness, this doesn't mean our children need to. Each person will find their own relationship to themselves at their own pace. So for today's task, and this is the task of a spiritual warrior indeed, it is to enter that beautiful space of non-judgment, that space where good and bad doesn't exist, where we live in a non-dual acceptance of life. What that means is we don't look for comparisons. We don't look for whether something is better or lesser than. We simply accept whatever is showing up, infallible or fallible, perfect or imperfect, as exactly as it is meant to. Now, this takes training of the highest proportions. I'm reminded of the poet Rumi. He said, and I really try to implement this in my own life, somewhere beyond right and wrong, beyond that, right and wrong, there's a garden. I will meet you there. Imagine relating to our children like that our children and us will meet in the space beyond the duality of good and bad. So what Rumi really meant is get off your delusions of power, of hierarchy, of superiority, of control. He understood that that is all the face of the ego. He understood that the ego is all the mask of fear. Rumi understood that we need to shed that in order to connect to another spirit, essence to essence. So in order to accept our children, we need to let go of all these ideations that we know what is better for them, that we know what is good for them, and we know what is bad. We need to remove ideations around lesser than or better than. And we need to simply enter a state of wholeness and celebration of worth as it is. So for today's exercise, I want you to, again, reflect on your judgmental self. I want you to write down all your judgments of yourself on the left-hand side of a column. And then I want you to write all the judgments of your children on the right-hand side of the column. Now, this is very much akin to the other exercise we did about what parts of your child you don't accept, but it's slightly different. Judgments are really about the labels you put on yourself. You know, when you look in the mirror, what are the labels that you say to your reflection? When you don't get a raise in your job or you don't get the job you wanted, what are your inner critics saying to you? I want you to write your judgments of yourself and then of your children. So now look at your list. I want you to take a pen and I want you to circle the judgments of yourself or your children that you believe, and you have to be honest, that you can truly release today. Is there anything on that paper that you're willing to let go of, that you're willing to release and say that this is part of my past, but I don't want to carry it into my future? You know, ever so occasionally, it's really important to do this exercise because I call this the judgment detox exercise, where you just begin to cleanse yourself of all this baggage that forms itself into labels in your mind, because it's really cluttering your inner state and it's obstructing your capacity to accept yourself and your children. So today, now that you've written down all your judgments, you're more aware of them. So now watch your interactions with your children. Notice your voice of adjudicator. Notice your voice of persecutor and critic. Pay attention to that voice. Don't imagine that you don't have it. All parents have this voice. We need to begin to notice it so that we can begin to tame it. And once we begin to quieten it down, it will slowly recede into quietude and oblivion. So try this powerful exercise of non-judgment today. Write about your findings, share it with the tribe, and I will see you back here tomorrow.